Okay, Johnathan, are you there and ready?
Hello. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. I'm here. My talk is still 73% compiled. So if we could leave it another couple of minutes, that would be great.
Okay. Just let us know when you're ready.
Brilliant. Thank you. I should say though, there's no need to then record this version of it. I can just give you the film if you want afterwards.
Well, it might. I prefer to record okay. It. Maybe do both, but I think it's nice to see what emerges in the discussion.
Oh, I see. You have that. You include that on the YouTube as well, do you? Yeah.
Yes, unless somebody sort of says something that they ask, please, and all that. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sure. It's just I know some I wasn't sure that's what you were doing. Sometimes people cut the discussion out for the recording, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. Well, we would if it involved directly clinical material.
Sure. Yeah.
Alternatively, Johnathan, if you just want to read out the talk.
Hold on. We're here. Just now double check that it works. Reasons why people might think it's good. All right, thank you for your patience. It's done. So
okay, can I introduce you just very briefly, and you can say whatever else you want to add or subtract to what I'm going to say. So this is Johnathan Webber. I'm very pleased he's taken up the offer to come and speak to us. He's written, I think, a really important book on new existentialism. He has, I think, a slight leaning to Sartre, if I've got it right. And he's come to explore some implications of his work for psychotherapy. So Johnathan's from the University of Cardiff. He's head of philosophy there. And please, over to you, Johnathan. You've got an hour and a half, I should say. Yeah, apologies. Yeah, till 10:30 for questions, for your film, whatever.
Brilliant. Fantastic. Thank you. And thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm a professor of philosophy at Cardiff University. I'm not a psychotherapist. I have no training at all in psychotherapy. So when Del says what I'd like to explore is some implications of this sort of psychotherapy, that's kind of what I'm really interested in is what you think about that, right? So what I'm going to do in the talk is outline what I think are the important features of the work of Sartre and Beauvoir as I see it for that has potential for understanding psychotherapy and psychotherapeutic practice and understanding the origins and causes of distress. But I might be completely wrong about that because, as I say, I'm not a therapist. My only kind of connection with the world of therapy is through discussions with people like Del and like Richard Pearce, who appears in the lectures briefly, attending various conferences and so on. So I'm very much an amateur in the psychotherapy world, and that's why I would love to hear what you have to say about this. Okay, so hopefully, Del, could you give me the power to share my screen? I think that means making me a co-host.
Yep, surely. There we go.
Yeah, great, thank you. All right. So here we go.
Johnathan, can't hear you. You're on mute.
Analytic tradition of 20th century philosophy and psychology. I think that Sartre and Beauvoir's existentialism. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. I'm going to try that again. Okay, got it. All right, take two. Right, so what I want to talk about today is the relation between the philosophy of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir and the kind of Freudian psychoanalytic tradition of 20th century philosophy and psychology. I think that Sartre and Beauvoir's existentialism has important contributions to make to the theory and practice of psychotherapy, but I think that a lot of these contributions have been obscured by the fact that their work is often kind of typecast in a way, categorized purely in the context of the existential tradition of thought, epitomized by Kierkegaard and Heidegger, I think are probably the paradigm existential thinkers, but there are, of course, many, many others who are often included in that camp. I think this is a shame because, as I say, I think Sartre and Beauvoir's work is much richer than is evident if you see them purely within that context. So we're going to look at what happens if we read them within the broad psychoanalytic tradition, the Freudian tradition. And I think this will provide insights into the nature and origins of distress and into potential therapeutic routes for reducing stress. And I think it provides an original, perhaps, but also important way of thinking about the goals of therapy. So I should add at this stage, I'm not a therapist. I've had no training in psychotherapy. My interest in this is from the perspective of a philosopher who works on existentialism and who talks regularly with people who work in psychotherapy about this, some of whom are, of course, very interested in this same literature that I'm interested in. The talk is going to comprise of 4 stages. First, I'm going to say a bit about what I mean to say that the Sartrean and Beauvoirian existentialism stands in the Freudian tradition. That might be a surprising claim to some of you who know this literature well, but I think it's perfectly defensible. In fact, I think it's the right view to have of their work. Then I'm going to say a bit more about their existentialism, particularly their concept of projects, and I'm going to relate that to some origins of distress. And I'm going to talk about freedom, which is obviously a very central concept in French existentialism. And I'm going to talk about the prospects for overcoming distress, what freedom means for each of these thinkers, and how that can be drawn upon for psychotherapeutic practice. And then I'm going to end with some very brief and sketchy thoughts about neurodiversity. I just think that they don't know anything about neurodiversity, Sartre and Beauvoir, and as a result, there are limitations, at the very least, to the applicability of their philosophy. But I think we need to think very carefully about how those limitations operate. We won't have time in my talk, at least, to think very carefully about that, but I want to sketch out some directions in which that kind of thought can go, because it's not simply a matter of just accepting or rejecting the existentialist picture. Okay, so pretty much everything I'm going to say summarizes various themes and aspects of my book, Rethinking Existentialism, which goes into all of this in great detail and is available in paperback from Oxford University Press. You can get that from all good bookshops, and you can also get it from some bad bookshops. That's the end of my advert. So I'm going to start with the thought that existentialism is often portrayed as a kind of alternative to Freudian psychoanalysis, right? It's usually set up in opposition to Freud, or quite often when people talk about its relation to psychoanalysis. And there's a very good reason for this. So early on in Being and Nothingness, Sartre famously argues against Freud's understanding of the mind. Freud's understanding of the mind evolves, obviously, throughout his long career, and his terminology evolves with it. But pretty much throughout his career, he thinks of the mind as divided between two regions, roughly, and one of those regions is the one that we find it difficult to understand what's going on there. We may even repress and resist attempts, or we repress parts of our mind and resist attempts to uncover them. And those kind of repressed desires or drives are responsible sometimes for distress and other forms of difficulty. Sartre famously argues against this idea of dividing the mind into kind of accessible and inaccessible, or the clear light of day, if you like, and the kind of murky depths of the id. Sartre satirizes it in part of his argument. He talks about it as building a demarcation line in the mind with customs, passport services, currency control, etc. Right? But his criticism is serious, and it's, I think, well developed and well motivated. He thinks that the Freudian picture, the whole idea of a demarcation line, is untenable, and the reason it's untenable is that you can't understand how the processes at that demarcation line operate. They've either got to be part of the murky depths, or they've got to be part of the clear light of day, and either way they can't do what Freud thinks they do. That's the essence of the argument. I put it here as saying, look, Sartre thinks there's a border, there are border officials, but there's no way of understanding what the border officials do, or which side of the border they belong on, because they've got to belong on one or the other. So that's just a rough picture. As I say, in my book, I go into this in a lot of detail. But for our purposes, this is one of the reasons why people might think it's surprising or even mistaken to think of Sartre as in the Freudian tradition. Here's another reason. So this is Richard Pierce, who passed away recently, an existential therapist who I used to regularly discuss Sartre with, who's also one of the best Sartre scholars I've ever met. In his article, The Liberation Psychologist, a tribute to Jean-Paul Sartre, Richard talks about a divide between those who perceive human action to be grounded in human agency and reflective of choice, and those who view behavior to be mechanically determined and therefore subject to correction. Okay. Now, Richard talks a lot about Sartre in this article, as the title indicates. He doesn't mention Freud, but I think he quite clearly has Freud in his sights as one of the characters who view behavior as mechanically determined and therefore subject to correction. And the Freudian tradition largely is often at least characterized as a mechanistic tradition, as understanding the mind in this mechanical way. And again, so this might seem like a reason to reject my view that existentialism, Sartrean and Beauvoirian existentialism, is a kind of Freudianism, because it looks like there's a basic opposition. You know, Sartre and Beauvoir emphasize agency and subjectivity and choice and freedom and so on, whereas the psychoanalytic tradition emphasizes this kind of more deterministic and mechanistic picture. I think those are both very good reasons to be skeptical about what I'm going to say, but here's why I think that existentialism is part of the Freudian tradition. Sartre, Being and Nothingness, is a very big book, and it's sometimes read as though it's a series of essays on distinct topics, but it really is the elaboration of a single theory. And it's the continual kind of unpacking of the core concepts of that theory. So the claims he's making early on in the book, they're not the same as the claims that he gets to by the very end. I think he still largely agrees with what he starts out with, right? But it becomes much, much more sophisticated as it goes on, all of it, every aspect of it. And as I mentioned, the famous critique of Freud is very early on in the book. Towards the end, there's an enormous section called Existential Psychoanalysis, which is a continual dialogue with Freud, in which Sartre develops his own conception of psychoanalysis. And his dialogue with Freud is not wholly critical, right? I mean, he's already rejected Freud's conception of the mind, and he sticks to that, but he finds a lot of very valuable insights in Freud's work, and he wants to retain those insights, and he wants to explain them as well. So that's where I think the most sophisticated dialogue with Freud occurs in Sartre's work, actually, although he does continue in dialogue with Freud throughout his career. But it's not just Being and Nothingness I'm going to talk about. I'm also going to talk about The Second Sex. The Second Sex is perhaps better organized than Being and Nothingness. So again, there's an early section which is a critical analysis of Freud. But in this case, what Sartre does in Being and Nothingness is that his first discussion of Freud is wholly negative and wholly critical. And then he only comes back to a kind of more detailed and balanced and nuanced engagement much later in the book. Beauvoir, her early section on Freud, is explicitly about separating out the aspects of Freud's theory that she thinks should be retained from those that should not. So she's got a lot of respect for Freud and has clearly taken a lot from Freud throughout the book, but she's also, like Sartre, critical of the mechanistic picture of the mind and of that kind of division of the mind. The theory of gender that Beauvoir develops through The Second Sex is continually in dialogue with Freud, sometimes explicitly and sometimes implicitly. Right. So, you know, Freud looms very large in her thinking, just as he does in Sartre's. So when I say that their work is not wholly critical of Freud, here's what I mean. I think there are some key aspects of Freud's work that Sartre and Beauvoir retain. Okay, they retain the idea that problematic behavior can be caused by deep motivations. Problematic behavior being behavior that causes the individual whose behavior it is distress, or directly or indirectly by causing other problems in their life, which are then distressing. And of course, problematic behavior can also be behavior that causes other people distress, either directly or indirectly, in the same way. The Freudian idea that these kind of actions have kind of deep roots in the individual's kind of motivations in what the individual is trying to achieve in life, or wants in life, is Sartre and Beauvoir, I think, an important insight, right? And they want to retain that. They also agree that we might not know our deepest motivations. And I'm going to say some more about how that can be later on. But they think that's an important Freudian insight that needs to be retained. They think that those deep motivations explain some of our emotions and our other feelings, like emotional outbursts, but also kind of calmer emotions, if you like, calmer feelings that kind of influence the way we see the world on a continuously on a day-to-day basis, and that those feelings and those emotions reflect our motivations, and they can reflect some of our deepest motivations, which we don't know necessarily what those motivations are. And also, I'm not really going to have time to talk about this bit, but one of the things that's really interesting, and I do talk about it in the book, is that Sartre and Beauvoir both are interested in Freud's idea that conscious desires and conscious actions can symbolize the deeper motivations that we don't necessarily know what they are. So it's not just that they can directly manifest them, but sometimes that there can be a kind of symbolic relation between behavior and or a desire and that kind of deep motivation, and that this might perhaps be a useful guide, or they want to consider whether or not that kind of symbolic relation can be a useful guide to a therapist or an analyst who wants to understand those motivations. So again, this is a very Freudian idea, this of symbolism, and they want to retain it and explain it. And finally, they agree with Freud that all of this stuff, the idea that our deeper motivations might be unknown to us, that they can be the cause of distress, and that they are sometimes manifest symbolically rather than directly or explicitly, is all due to the relation between the individual and their social context. It's due in large part to the internalization of social norms. And Freud, obviously in his later work, has this conception of the superego, for example, which is very much a kind of distilled set of social norms that are internalized deep in the individual's mind. That's not the way Beauvoir and Sartre see it, but they're still interested in this idea of the way social norms get internalized and become a kind of internal policing of our desires and our behavior. So when you look at that list, right, you can see that they are in many ways very Freudian. They owe a lot to Sigmund Freud, as they themselves regularly say in their work. So what is it that is different? Well, as we've seen, they both reject Freud's mechanistic model of the mind. All right, they reject the division with the passport control and currency control and customs, and they reject the kind of mechanism that is part of that picture, the idea that this stuff all just operates according to its own laws of energy or whatever. The reason they reject it, and I think this is really interesting, this is what makes them, I think, very deeply Freudian, is that the reason they reject it is that they think it doesn't explain what Freud wants to explain. That list on the last slide of the things they think are really important Freudian insights, they then look at Freud's model of the mind and say, well, this isn't going to explain how those things happen. It just can't do it. We need an explanation. We need to understand how these things happen, because otherwise we can't really understand our own selves, our own being, if you like. And Freud's picture just fails to provide that kind of explanation. That's the essence, I think, of their criticism of Freud. So they like his insights into human behavior. They think his explanation, his theory of mind, is useless, absolutely fails to explain it. And so they need to develop a model of the mind which does explain those insights. And that's what they think they're doing when they're developing their conception of projects as the kind of roots of human behavior. And that's what drives all of Sartre's existentialism in Being and Nothingness and onwards. It's what drives Beauvoir's existentialism in The Second Sex and onwards, and actually earlier as well. More detail of that in my book. But that's what they're doing, right? When they're talking about projects, that's what they're interested in, an understanding of the way the mind works that will explain those Freudian insights. They also think there are other things they want to explain as well, but they are driven by this Freudian question. All right, so I said there were 4 main phases. That was phase 1 of the talk. That's the relation between existentialism and the psychoanalytic tradition. And as I said, the second section is on projects. Now, projects are the core of the model of the mind that Sartre and Beauvoir develop in large part as a way of trying to explain how it happens that those Freudian insights are true, how we can have deep motivations that might be unknown to us and are symbolically manifested, but are also productive of behavior that causes distress, right? It's because they think the mind is constructed as a kind of hierarchy of projects. And a project, I'm not convinced this is a great name for their concept, by the way. Maybe it's better in mid-20th century French than it is in early 21st century English, but I think the overtones of the word in our ordinary kind of conceptual repertoire as English speakers in the early 21st century are misleading. So I think you need to sort of put any thoughts you have about what projects are to one side and just think in terms of what they mean by this word. Okay, so a project has a value at its core. This is essential. So a project is built around something that you value or disvalue, something you positively value, or that you negatively value or positively disvalue, right? That you think is good and that you want to promote, or that you think is bad and that you want to minimize or avoid. Project can be at pretty much any level of generality, right? So it could be an extremely general project. One of Sartre's examples is the project of staying alive, right? Staying alive is something that most people do most of the time, or at least try to do most of the time. It structures a lot of our lives, right? It's part of the explanation of lots and lots of things that you do, and it's because you value being alive if you do, and that therefore is a project for Sartre. There can be much more specific projects. So you could have a project of wanting to write a book or trying to write a book. More importantly, you could have the project of writing this book, this particular book, right? The project of taking this particular course or attending this particular talk. And so that's specific because it's about something particular. So what does a project involve apart from the value, which I've said is at its core? Well, at the very least, it comprises 2 other things. One is knowledge, or perhaps a better word would be information, and abilities. That's skills, techniques, whatever, that have been developed in pursuit of that valued end. So your project of staying alive involves lots of things that involve knowledge and skills that you have developed. For example, knowing how to earn money, knowing how to buy food or acquire food, knowing how to cook it, knowing how to eat it, knowing how to wash up, right? and all of that, right? Everything that you do, which is really just kind of maintaining your existence. I mean, you know, don't get me wrong, you might be a great cook. There might be a lot more to your food than merely maintaining existence. But at bottom level, that is what you're going to be doing, even if you can't be bothered to cook anything particularly nice this evening. So the project is a kind of concatenation of knowledge and abilities that have clustered around the value and are explained by that value. That's why you've developed that knowledge and those abilities, is because of that value. And that knowledge and those abilities accrue as time goes on. The longer you continue to pursue the same project, the longer you continue to act on the same value, the more of this, the knowledge and the more abilities around it you're going to accrue to some extent. I mean, there may be a limit on that, and I guess the limit is going to depend on the project, but by and large, there's a kind of continuous process of refining the project by doing it. Now, here's the other thing that's crucial about projects. They form hierarchies. So it's not the case that you just have a bunch of little projects, right? They're all connected up with each other because they all interact with each other in different ways. And one of the most important ways they interact with each other is kind of vertically, if you like. They're a kind of hierarchy. Some projects we can think of as deeper than other projects, which are ways of pursuing those deeper projects, right? So, for example, why do I get up in the morning, even though I don't want to, when my alarm clock goes off, and get ready and rush out of the house and get to the cafe in time to unlock the doors, switch the lights on, sweep the floor, set the coffee pot going? Well, sweep the floor, set the coffee pot going. Well, because I value keeping my job. So my immediate project of getting to work on time, setting everything up, is explained by my deeper project of keeping my job, right? Why do I have that project? Why do I want to carry on with this job? Well, because I value getting paid. I don't have another job that I can walk into. Why do I value getting paid? Well, ultimately, because I value staying alive and maybe doing other things with the money too. But that's the kind of bottom line, as it were, the deepest project perhaps that is needed here in this explanation. So these projects are a kind of hierarchy where the ones, as I think of it, the ones that are higher up in the hierarchy, kind of nearer the surface level, are explained by ones that are deeper and deeper and deeper, until at some point you get to one that isn't really explained by anything, and that's a kind of fundamental or bedrock kind of project. Okay, so that's what projects are. How do they function? Well, this is the other crucial thing about projects. It's not that we necessarily think about our projects and kind of reflect on our projects much. It's more that in order to enact our projects, we just respond to the world as the way that, as it seems to us. The alarm clock goes off, and that just feels like a demand. I've got to get out of bed. I've got to get there on time. If I leave now, I can still catch the bus, right? Those are demands. There are other kinds of reasons that we experience in the world. Okay. Some things are inviting. Some things seem attractive to us. Some seem repellent, right? Some seem to demand a response. Some don't. They're just merely requesting a response. Some features of the world as we experience it seem really interesting to us. Some seem really boring, right? And so the world is not simply a load of objects. It's a network of reasons, attractions and repulsions, and things inviting us to behave one way or inviting us to behave another way or demanding that we behave one way or another, and so on. That's how we experience the world. And the reason we experience the world that way is not because the world is magically alive with this stuff, really. It's that we see the world through the filter of our projects. Okay, so all of those features of the world actually reflect our own projects. The demand of the alarm clock is only there because I value getting to work on time. If I didn't, the same noise from the same object would not be experienced in the same way. All right. Sartre puts a lot of emphasis on this in Being and Nothingness as the kind of structure of the world and how it's the world as we directly experience it and how it's ultimately due to our own projects, even though that's not obvious in first order experience, and it may not even be obvious on reflection, depending on the projects. So our behavior responds to reasons that we find in the world, but the reasons are only there because of our projects. That's how our behavior responds to our projects, right? Indirectly. What does this mean about our knowledge of our own motivations? So obviously our deep motivations are our projects. Our immediate motivations are the reasons, right? Why did you rush out of the house? Well, because I'm late. I've got to get there on time. Yeah, but more deeply, why do you have to get there on time? Oh, well, because I value keeping my job, right? So the deeper motivations are our projects, and they become deeper and deeper because they form not just a complicated network, but also a hierarchy. Now, some of those projects have been deliberately chosen and undertaken. Being a parent is a good example. That is usually something that is chosen and deliberately undertaken, at least in our society in the early 21st century. It is usually something that is chosen and undertaken. Having a job in a cafe, wanting to keep that job, not wanting to get a different job. Those are exactly the kind of projects which reflect deliberative decision making, right? And we explicitly choose, and we know we do, but then we sort of undertake those projects and we commit to them and we start to behave in appropriate ways, or at least we should do. Some of them are going to be the results of decisions or thoughts we had quite a long time ago, and we might not remember the explicit decision making, the explicit reasons why we committed to some particular goal or to some particular value at all, but it may now be kind of knitted into our complicated network of projects. It may be related to lots of other projects in lots of other ways. So it's quite well embedded and quite influential, even though we may not anymore remember why we ever adopted that value or started to care about it in the first place. But also there may be projects that are adopted unthinkingly. That is, you just do them. And you've never really actually explicitly stopped and thought about why. For a lot of people, staying alive is like that. They've been doing it all their life, or most of their life, and they haven't necessarily ever stopped and thought, do I actually want to do this? Instead, they just get on with it and do lots of other things which require being alive. But the actual question of whether to stay alive, it isn't necessarily one that people ask. Obviously, people do, but you don't have to in order to be pursuing the project, right? It's still a project, even if you've never thought about it. And what this means, right, is that we don't necessarily know why the world seems to us the way it does, right? Why does the world present me with these reasons and not some other set of reasons? I don't necessarily know, right? Because they reflect my projects, but I don't necessarily know what those projects are. I might not have thought about them, or I might have thought about them a long time ago, and no longer really know why I value the things that I value. And as a result, don't necessarily know why the world seems to present the reasons, the barriers, the demands, the invitations, the proscriptions that it does present to me. Now, I think Sartre thinks that can in and of itself be a source of distress, right? A source of kind of alienation. You find that the world is making these demands and not making other demands, or just presenting you with a particular set of reasons which you don't really necessarily know why. But that is the way the world seems to you. It's not the way you seem necessarily. Okay. What's more, Sartre thinks that some projects can actually hide themselves. So one of his examples is the Inferiority Project. This is his take on what Freud called the inferiority complex. In the Inferiority Project, Sartre thinks some people actually positively value the idea that they are somehow naturally inferior to other people. And that this might be a value that somebody has adopted, for example, early in life, during childhood, as a result of constant criticism or their parents always being disappointed with them, right? Or something like that. Sort of shifting the blame, no longer being responsible for continually disappointing your parents because I can't help it because I'm just naturally inferior is a tempting project in that situation, Sartre thinks. And people can take on that project and then continue in it and kind of forget the reasons for it. Not only forget though, because, and this is the crucial point, because projects shape how you see the world, because they shape the reasons that you find in the world, the reasons that confront you, a project like the Inferiority Project isn't going to be easy to uncover, because every time you think about your behavior, it's just going to look like evidence of actual inferiority. It's not going to look like the manifestation of a project of trying to prove yourself inferior, which is, on Sartre's view, what it is. So because a project shapes how you see the world, it therefore shapes how you see yourself as well and your own behavior. And that's the way in which projects can get buried or bury themselves, hide themselves. The Inferiority Project is just one example of what Sartre calls bad faith, right? So here's a much more general version of the same thing. If you see yourself, if you value seeing yourself as having some innate fixed personality that's responsible for your behavior and that you can't do anything about, if you value that view of yourself, then that project will shape your experience of the world. It will shape your experience of other people, and it will shape your experience of your own behavior. And all of that will just look like the products of people's innate fixed personalities, because that's the project, is to see the world that way. That's what you value. So again, you're not going to notice that you have that project, right? It's just going to seem that that's the way the world really is, and that you really are. So your own projects might be the source of distressing problems. And at the same time, those projects, or perhaps other projects of yours, might make it difficult for you to realize this. And that mystery about the source of difficulties, the mystery itself, I think Sartre thinks, and Beauvoir thinks, can be distressing. And the aim of existential psychoanalysis then for Sartre is to uncover the individual's projects, to help them see why they see the world the way they see the world. Okay, stage 3. We're running out of time, so I may need to speed up a little. But we've done most of the work so far, right? This is not another issue. This kind of builds on the point about projects. So Sartre argues for that conception of projects that I've just outlined in Being and Nothingness, which was published in 1943. And Beauvoir employs the same conception of projects in The Second Sex in 1949. But she employs a rather different conception of freedom to the one that Sartre employs in Being and Nothingness. Sartre's crucial point about freedom in Being and Nothingness is that projects can have no inertia of their own, right? They can't resist your attempt to change them. They persist only because we're committed to them, to our own projects. They also persist partly because they're supported by other projects in that network, so that changing one will actually require changing other things too. But nevertheless, there's no kind of being or no reality or no force to a project other than it being something that we want to do, that we're committed to. So we can just abandon any project so long as we know we have it, and we can simply adopt a new one. Right? That is what Sartre calls radical freedom. It's radical because it's freedom over the roots of our behavior. Now, I think there's a lot wrong with that theory, and so does Simone de Beauvoir. In The Second Sex, Beauvoir thinks that projects gain in inertia and influence over your behavior the more you pursue them. Just like they accrue knowledge and skills, they also accrue kind of force or inertia and influence, reach, if you like. She doesn't give a name to this process. I've named it sedimentation in my book because it's similarity to a distinct idea in Merleau-Ponty's philosophy. But as I say, that's not Beauvoir's name for it. But it is a theory of freedom for Beauvoir. It's how freedom operates. Your chosen behavior embeds your chosen values, which shapes your feelings and your perceptions. So it's freedom, it's your behavior that's changing and shaping the roots of your own understanding of the world and of the reasons that you confront in the world. But the same process creates difficulties, even though it is a process of freedom. The most famous sentence in The Second Sex occurs at the beginning of volume 2. One is not born, but becomes a woman. This is part of what she means by becomes in that sentence. In upbringing, some projects are encouraged and some projects are discouraged. And which ones are encouraged and which ones are discouraged depend on whether you're a boy or a girl. By the time you reach adulthood, you have a complicated network of sedimented projects. By the time you reach a position of maturity where you can reflect on your values and reflect on what's important to you and what should be important to you, you have a set of sedimented projects which may well be built on values which perhaps you now no longer endorse. But that's not enough simply to remove those projects because of sedimentation. And that too can be a source of distress, thinks Beauvoir. One might be distressed at failing to live up to the ideals that were instilled in you through your upbringing. Beauvoir thinks that's inevitable for the ideals of femininity because the ideals of femininity are incoherent. So you cannot live up to them. It's impossible, right? And one might also feel distress even when one has explicitly rejected those ideals because they're so deeply instilled in your outlook. Even though you no longer endorse them, they may still be influential over your desires, over your behavior, and over your self-image. But also because you think you've rejected them, you might not realize that this is the problem, right? So there's a kind of distress that's being caused, but you don't agree with it, you don't endorse the values that it seems to be espousing or that it seems to be built on. And as a result, it may just be a mystery to you why it is that you are feeling this particular kind of distress. And Beauvoir's focus, obviously, in The Second Sex is on gender, but this picture of how the mind works is quite general, right? So the same kind of structure could explain all sorts of other situations as well. Now, unlike Sartre, Beauvoir does not explicitly develop what she would call existential psychoanalysis, like Sartre does in Being and Nothingness. But we can readily see the difference that this idea of sedimentation makes. Okay. So one goal of therapy, on Beauvoir's view, a picture of the mind would be to uncover the influence of deeply sedimented projects on the individual's thoughts and feelings. And that's going to involve a certain level of social analysis too, because that's where those sedimented projects will have come from. All right. Finally, then, the extent of freedom. As I said, I wanted to say a few little thoughts about neurodiversity, because obviously there's Sartre and Beauvoir are sort of classical philosophers in this sense, that they offer one picture of the mind, and this is how the mind works in it. And the idea that minds might work in different ways is kind of off their radar, right? It's just not there. Obviously, they know that people suffer distress, and obviously they know that some people's minds simply don't seem to function the way normal minds function, but they don't really know much about this, and so they have this kind of paradigm of what's normal, and then other things may be sort of broken or something like that. But the idea that there are just differently functioning kinds of minds is just foreign to them, right? So they think that the reasons we find in the world and respond to in feelings and behavior reflect our projects always, for all of us, all the time, and that those projects are developed in response to our social environment, and we can change those projects, whether we can do it instantaneously, like Sartre thinks in Being and Nothingness, or whether it's a process of sedimentation, as Beauvoir thinks in The Second Sex, and Sartre thinks later in his work as well, under Beauvoir's influence. Still, we do have some kind of freedom to change those projects. That's their picture. Returning to Richard Pearce, that is, who, at the start of the talk, I had a quote from Richard which separated out thinkers who think of human action to be grounded in human agency and reflective of choice rather than mechanistic. Clearly, the existentialists are in that camp, and they think of it as true of all human action without exception. So they think that there's no limit to that across human beings. But I think that's not true. In fact, I think it can't be true. Simone de Beauvoir were completely unaware, and Sartre and Beauvoir, sorry, were completely unaware of what we now think of as the autistic spectrum. They were completely unaware of a range of other diagnoses, which together fall under the umbrella term neurodiversity. Just wasn't something they knew about. Thoughts, feelings, and behaviors that are explained in terms of autistic traits, for example, or other traits of neurodiversity, are precisely not due to the individual's projects and values, I think. So I think that's a clear challenge to their kind of absolutism about projects as the roots of behavior. And at the same time, any distressing thoughts or feelings or behavior that are explained by autistic traits or other traits of neurodiversity are also not, in Richard Pearce's words, mechanically determined and therefore subject to correction. That's not the right way to think about neurodiversity either. Right? So it's not, as it were, evidence for the other team, the mechanistic and deterministic picture of human beings. So what we must accept, I think, is that our knowledge of neurodiversity reveals that Sartre and Beauvoir were mistaken about the extent of human freedom. But I don't think that shows that they're just mistaken about human agency altogether. I think that perhaps their theories of projects and freedom can be adjusted to accommodate this new knowledge and enriched by this new knowledge of neurodiversity. And I think that one of the key advantages of that might be that it would help us to understand neurodiversity in agential terms, i.e. in terms of subjective agency, rather than in a kind of mechanistic picture. Because they've developed this very sophisticated understanding of what that agential way of understanding behavior is. Clearly their version as it stands isn't going to work for understanding neurodiversity, but I think that if it can be augmented with our knowledge of neurodiversity, then both existentialism and the understanding of neurodiversity will benefit. As I say, that's very sketchy, but that's at this early stage of thinking about this issue, all I really have to say on it, though I'd be very interested in any discussions that anyone would like to have on that. Okay, that's it. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you for listening. And I look forward to your questions.
Well,
and I couldn't resist one last advert.
Johnathan, thank you very much indeed. Both what you're saying, but also the time you've taken in preparing such an excellent talk for us. I'm very grateful. So it's time for some thoughts and questions. John, I'd actually like to start, if I may, because I'm not sure that I've understood the last part with regard to what is meant by neurodiversity. I've always been concerned that there's this thing, I don't know, I am my choices or whatever. There's the whole issue of being subject to something, being subject to language, right? That doesn't seem to come into it. There's a question like, they were influenced by Levinas, but being subject to ethics, being subject, Derrida's subject to language, subject to writing, and so on. Yeah. So, which I'd have thought is something other than perhaps neurodiversity, and there's something other than perhaps the mechanistic stuff of Freud. Yeah. And so there's a danger that they're perhaps too modern, and a bit, moving in the egocentric, if not narcissistic, sort of Frank Sinatra school of existentialism, if you see what I mean. And I just wondered on your thoughts on that.
Yeah, thank you. So this is something that I haven't really talked about much at all really in the talk. But I think so. One of the things that they think is important about projects is when I talked about kind of knowledge and skills as being part of the project, the kind of knowledge involved includes knowledge of the social world, right, and knowledge of how the social world is generally understood. So that's a kind of linguistic knowledge. It's a kind of conceptualization of the kinds of people we meet, the kinds of objects that there are, the kinds of expectations that people have. And similarly, the skills involved are partly skills in navigating that kind of set of social meanings and social structures. So those kind of meanings and the kind of social understanding of the social world, if you like, the kind of prevalent way of thinking about people and things becomes kind of internalized into the projects in that way.
Aren't they speaking as if they could be free of that, as if you could understand that? It's right when she says, that women aren't born. That there's an understanding of that, but still in our understanding, we are still subject to language. We can never be free of it in that way. And whilst that was, I think, the wrong time for Saussure and things like that. It's as if they could be free. That if you could understand the social and be clearer about that, then you'd be free.
Yeah, but so partly, I mean, obviously you're right. What neither Sartre nor Beauvoir ever really did was I think get to grips with that kind of question about language, but also about kind of conceptual thought generally, how much it's actually constrained by the concepts that we pick up from our environment in the first place. But I think even so, the idea that you can't kind of break out of the system completely, because then you just wouldn't have any concepts to employ, is compatible with the idea that you can use some parts of it to critique other parts of it, right? You can, and so Beauvoir thinks that you can, reflect on the kind of gender norms and expectations and requirements that have been instilled in you, and you can write a book like The Second Sex, which is a critique of those and is written in a shared language, right? You can do that. What you can't do is step out the system completely, but in that localized way, you can certainly kind of reject that conceptual setup. Yeah,
very helpfully. But let's open up the questions to comments to other people, please.
I was going.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry.
Go on, Pat.
Oh, no, Daniel, you got your hand up. Sorry, I didn't see that.
No, go ahead, Trish. I will speak after.
I just wondered about the sense of belonging as a value and what we're allowed to belong to, what we can't belong to, and the possibility of how options come to us, because I suppose choices require options and possibilities. And I guess I was thinking about psychotherapy, and I was thinking about a sense of discovering a new option, discovering a new place you can belong, discovering a new sense, people belonging to themselves, belonging to groups, to others. And I wondered if there was anything in there about belonging as a value and maybe as a motivator, a bit like staying alive, to belong to something.
Right. Yeah, good. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, so there kind of is, but not in a good way.
Okay.
So I think one of the things they're worried about is the kind of constraints of belonging, or the kind of constraints of seeing yourself as belonging to a particular group because you've always been told that, or because some other part of the world sees you a particular way. So there's a lot of that goes on in both Being and Nothingness and The Second Sex, to do with, for example, class consciousness, kind of gender construction, and so on. But again, they're always seeing that as a kind of social imposition, if you like. Whereas I think what you're thinking of there is something much more liberating, which is that you can kind of open up possibilities of belonging to different groups and different communities in different ways. It's not something, I don't think, something that they either really talk much about. I guess then the question would be whether their system nonetheless offers any help, any insights into that. And I guess, yeah, I mean, I guess it can. Well, here's one of the things about existentialism. It's often seen as, and this is the fault of some existential thinkers, as very, very individualistic and kind of solipsistic, like as though the only things that can kind of come into a person's mind as options or choice, possibilities and so on, have to be generated by their own thought. And then the worry is, of course, that's always going to be very constrained, because there are going to be plenty of things you just can't think of or won't think of because of the commitments you've already got, or the particular framework that you were raised in, or whatever. But there's no reason why it should really be like that. There's no reason why you shouldn't be able to be receptive to suggestions from other people. So I think, that's certainly an option.
Daniel?
Thank you. Thank you, Johnathan. Can you hear me? Yeah. Thanks. Thank you, Johnathan, for it was really very interesting. I have a question about the notion of freedom. I mean, Sartre and de Beauvoir are very good at pinching concepts from others, and they clearly pinched a lot from Freud. But it seems to me that there is a fundamental disagreement between them and Freud on the question of freedom, because as far as I understand, Freud doesn't believe in freedom, and he puts himself in line after Copernicus and Darwin, saying that he's shown that man is not a master in his own house, because where Sartre and Beauvoir have projects, he has drives, and the drives are not in our control in any way. So according to Freud, we are the opposite of free.
Well, I mean, so I guess there's room there for interpretation, right? So, I mean, the goal of psychoanalysis is that, you know, where id was, ego shall be, right? So the fact that we have drives and which we don't necessarily understand and which shape our desires and so on, it doesn't follow that determines all of our thought, right? Or all of our abilities to kind of reflect on our behavior and make decisions about it, or all of our abilities to have discussions about it. I mean, he did seem to think that therapy or psychoanalysis could be liberating from the constraints of the id as well. So I mean, I don't, in a way, disagree with your reading of Freud there, but I think some people might, right? I can see how there might be scope for thinking that there's a degree of freedom in Freud, which is the freedom of conscious, rational thought to come to its own conclusions, and perhaps with the help of an analyst to understand the id better and try to manage it and so on. So although you might not be. The master in the house metaphor is a little unfortunate because there's only ever one master, right? But it's more like you can take control over more of the mind or less of the mind with the right kind of tools and the right kind of help. Whether you call that freedom or not is another question. I do think that Freud's picture does certainly look very mechanistic. It's also a question, I guess. As I said before, the existentialist's kind of core criticism of Freud is that his model of the mind is incoherent, and that's why it can't explain the important things that he wants to explain. It may be that thought that I just articulated there is part of that incoherence, right? That you can't have that ability to take control and expand the ego and reduce the id, given what he thinks about the kind of mechanistic and deterministic structure of drives. But yeah.
Can I say something? First of all, just want to sort of say thank you for your presentation, because I think actually it's very clear what you presented. I don't think I've heard it presented so clearly before. So there are a number of things. One of them is that the notion of a project, I was thinking, it sounds not unlike what Nietzsche would refer to as our needs and concerns. There's a sort of first thought that, you know, but I suppose that I really enjoyed the presentation and followed it and was sort of in agreement with it until the last bit on neurodiversity. And then I try and tell you what I think some of the my problems are, is that I think that there we start to talk about something called the mind, and we then start to talk about you know, something neurological. And I'm not sure about how those two are equated. I think there might be arguments about there are different ideas, they're different, you know, minds. It's not, you know, we're not talking about, say, cognition. And I guess I'm thinking that does this introducing neurodiversity, does it fall foul of some of the arguments that Peter Hacker has been making against, he's been making these arguments against cognitivism. He has been, you know, saying something that it's very much part of the sort of scientism, and people get sort of very confused about the language. They start saying, my brain decided this, my brain thought that, and he's sort of very much championing, actually your brain doesn't decide things, people decide things, etc. So I'm thinking that the neurodiversity thing gets into that a bit. And I think there is something, isn't there, about I suppose it's about phenomenology, isn't it? It's that if we start to introduce things like autism, etc., we are kind of more, it sounds like we're being quite accepting of those sort of systems of diagnoses. And I think that existentialists, phenomenologists, existentialists, probably a bit more suspicious of that. So I just want to say that up to there, I thought it was really sort of with you, and then I thought I'm not sure about that last bit.
Right. Okay, thank you very much. Just very briefly on your first point about the Nietzsche, yeah, it may well be. I mean, Nietzsche says a lot of things, and I'm never quite sure how they're supposed to fit together. So, but that thought that the needs and concerns could well be essentially the same idea as projects is very interesting, and it could also be very helpful because it divides into these two categories. And needs and concerns are not necessarily the same thing, but they both seem to be varieties of project as existentialists think of them. Yeah, on the neurodiversity thing, I mean, yes, I mean, what I had to say there was very sketchy, and part of the sketchiness is in the terminology. So I use the word neurodiversity just because it is a handy label that people use. I didn't really want to commit to anything strongly neuro about neurodiversity. I could have called it cognitive diversity, I guess. So there's a raging debate about whether the underlying causes or underlying structures of neurodiversity are essentially neural, and whether they're neurochemical in particular, or whether we're better off understanding them as cognitive structures in a kind of cognitive science cognition kind of a way, rather than looking at the brain. And then, of course, there's also an enormous debate about whether the diagnostic procedure of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual and the ICD are a remotely appropriate or even helpful way to understand these things, because of course for those who are not familiar with this, the way it works is, there are lists of symptoms, and you have to meet a certain threshold to be diagnosed with each symptom, and then you have to meet a threshold of the right number of symptoms in order to be diagnosed with the condition. And this leads to an enormous diversity of possibilities, even within what's supposedly any one diagnosis, right? So there's a lot to be said about the difficulties of understanding neurodiversity, about whether the categorizations and the diagnoses are actually particularly helpful at the moment, about whether we should be looking, and if not, these questions are connected up. So if not, then what should we be doing when we're looking into this? Should we be looking at brains and neurochemistry? Should we be looking at cognitive processing? Or should we be looking, the symptoms are usually more kind of behavioral symptoms, or should we be looking at kind of phenomenology, right? At what the experience of the world is like for particular people, and whether that's a kind of route into understanding different ways in which different minds work. So all of that is currently a enormous debate in psychiatry and the philosophy of psychiatry. And that's one of the reasons I want to be very, very tentative here, because I don't want to make commitments to one side or another in that debate, because I don't know enough about it, or have any commitments to it. But I do think that a lot of what I read in that area still sounds very mechanistic. It still sounds very much like kind of observing something from the outside and seeing how it works, rather than trying to understand people as kind of agents who make decisions and make choices under whatever systems of constraint that they're under. Sorry, that was a bit of a ramble. Does that help?
No, I think it does a bit, because I think I'm understanding more clearly that you were trying to do something which is about saying something about the limits of that sort of the idea of agency, and something like that, and so maybe you weren't speaking so much about neurodiversity, but about I suppose that's just an example of what might make us think again about the picture that Sartre and Beauvoir are presenting, or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. But I'm also interested in the idea that the picture they presented can shed light on neurodiversity in the other direction too. Yeah.
Right,
Thank you.
I've got something to say. I've been trying to formulate what it is I have to say, because it's I didn't sleep very well last night. There's a party going on a few doors down from me, so I got woke up at 3 a.m, then shouted at someone out my window. So what I'm trying to get at is I was thinking about happiness. That's what I'm concerned about here. So let's say I'm depressed. I'm not depressed, but let's say I'm depressed, and so just forgive me, this is a little clunky, and you can always whip it into shape. And that might be because I'm not fulfilling my projects. So perhaps then I decide to go into therapy and it maybe seems that I'm in therapy, I'm setting about trying to fulfill my projects. And let's say I find out what they are, and maybe I achieve fulfilling them, and then I become happy. Well, for me, that in itself is a cause for depression. And what I mean by that is it seems quite mechanistic. It then seems like my quest for happiness is a bit like one of those games that you have on your phone, which incidentally I don't play, which is just quite addictive, and it makes you feel good just by playing within the game, just to that kick you get, and the people that make the phone game, they're basically like your projects, and that kind of feels like I'm just in some kind of game with an overseer, and then my happiness just feels like a phone game, and then I get depressed thinking about that. So that's where I'm at. I don't know if I've got my head concretely around what you've been saying today, but this is something that was sitting with me when I was listening to it, which I found very stimulating. Yeah, I enjoyed it a lot.
Good, thank you. Yeah, one of the things about existentialism is that obviously it has a reputation for being kind of miserable, and it's not entirely undeserved. I think partly because there's a lot of focus on things like distress, anxiety, despair, alienation. They never seem to talk about happiness, right? They're just kind of positive counterparts to the things they're concerned about, and not things that they've devoted much attention to actually understanding or theorizing about, and that's why all the texts are always about these negative moods. So I'm not sure whether they would agree that although the frustration of projects, and also sometimes the pursuit and the fulfillment of projects that are bad projects to have, can be causes of distress and anxiety and despair and so on. It doesn't follow that simply fulfilling projects isn't going to cause happiness, right? That's definitely part of their view, because you might just have bad projects.
Sure.
But understanding the causes of unhappiness in one's projects, and understanding ways that one's own view of the world could be refined or reformed in a way that would stop one from trying to pursue these bad aims, I think is what they're more interested in. Yeah.
So if I were in therapy, then I uncovered some of, my projects were quite negative, let's say, and let's say I managed to adjust those in therapy, maybe rewrite them by, maybe behaving better for myself and start living out some good projects. I still think then I would still feel like, even if I got to that point and rewrote some bad projects and wrote a new one, I still feel like I might get a bit meta about it and go, well, actually, I still feel like I'm living the dream, but I'm only happy because I'm living the dream.
So is the concern here that there's something sort of superficial and a bit fake about kind of,
maybe
reshaping what it is you care about so that you get what you care about?
Perhaps that's it. Yeah.
I mean, I think that is certainly a worry, but I think that it can't be that the idea is to simply reprogram people so that they don't feel unhappy anymore, and they only pursue goals that they can achieve. That seems like an awful picture of life. but the idea that your own kind of reflection on your own behavior, right? So if something's distressing you, and it turns out that distress is caused by your own projects, the fact that it is distress, the fact that it's making you unhappy itself indicates that it clashes with some other projects of yours, right? So I mean, those are the kind of cases that I think that the existentialists are often interested in. You've got some goals that you're trying to pursue, and you keep being frustrated in trying to achieve them, and it turns out the frustration is due to something else, like some other value system that you have, or some other aspect of the way you see yourself or the way you see the world. So it's not that you're just given, the idea is to just give you a set of toys that you can play with, as it were, happily. It's to kind of alleviate and remove the tensions between the commitments that you've already got. In a way.
Yeah, and then so maybe being happy is about getting to a point where you're finally living out projects that are good for you, so to the point where you can forget about the concept of projects, maybe. Almost, if you see what I mean. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It looks like you only need to think about this stuff when things are going wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe there's something about complexity might feel good, because even when you're talking about the projects, there's a task called downward arrow in CBT, and it felt very much like that, where you have to go to the next value and the next value to get to this core. But there is something very simplistic, and maybe there is something about complexity actually might add a richness to it. So maybe it feels good to be complicated.
So I wonder whether or not it's a bit like what you were saying about staying alive as a project. It's okay as a project. I mean, most of us want to do it, but if that's all your life consisted of, I just want to stay alive, then we'd be kind of worried about that. And similarly, if I want to be happy is the sort of main thing in your life, you might worry about it not, as you're saying, Trish, not being rich enough, not being complex enough, not being thoughtful enough about other things, other people, other aspects of you, or something like that.
You might end up a BG.
I tried not to think of that. But
yeah, I think for me the language is so important. I know we've kind of talked about it already, but the idea of staying alive, it's less about the physical element of it, existentially speaking, and it seems it's more to do with the perception of self, existentially. And I think that's why we do become, especially, psychotherapists and philosophers, become very uncomfortable talking about neuroscience, So the idea that we can be deconstructed and reduced down to neural circuitry and neurotransmission and these kind of things, suddenly is a very existentially frightening experience, So I think that's important as well. And the idea then that narratives, sociocultural narratives related to happiness. What is the concept of happiness? If you were to go to China, the concept of happiness has more to do with, I don't know, communal standing, how much you're contributing to the communal sort of identity, compared to the Western ideology of how much you're contributing only to your own individual identity. So I think it's just a few different ideas based on some of the conversations there. But yeah, interesting talk overall. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Johnathan, if I could ask you to try to clarify for myself, for Sartre and de Beauvoir, they're saying that the origin of projects is often hidden to us, or the base projects are hidden to us. And can you help me to understand where they say they are hidden and what it is that keeps them hidden? Because I'm just wondering what the difference is between their notion of what's hidden, and that of Freud's notion of what's repressed. Just wondering about that.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Yeah. So I think I think partly the difference is this: the repression for Freud is about and this is, I think, why Sartre and Beauvoir think that it's not really a coherent idea, is that to explicitly kind of repress a particular desire or drive seems to require recognizing what it is,
yes,
in order to then pretend you haven't got it. And that's the kind of source of the incoherence.
That's the problem with the boundary for them, that
Right.
it can't, because up above there's got to be a knowledge, so that there's that boundary doesn't work. That's fundamentally it, isn't it?
Exactly. So that, because otherwise, how can you push things down below the boundary and keep them down there? So another way of putting this: who are the passport control officials, right? Either they're down there too, in which case that kind of level of recognition and understanding isn't part of the system in the id, or they're part of the clear light of day, the
What did
conscious
they
id.
say?
But so their view is different. Yeah, exactly. So their view is this, that projects shape the way you see stuff, right? All of your thought and perception of the world and reflection on your own behavior is shaped by the values and understanding that you already have. And if that it is, so that's limited, right? So on the one hand, it might be that you simply, when you reflect on your behavior, you simply don't know why there's something that you do or something that you care about. And that could simply be because it was a long time ago that you last thought about it, that you last decided to care about it, and you've been acting on that for a long time and you just don't remember. Or it might be because it was kind of something that was encouraged in you throughout your upbringing, and it's taken you a long time to kind of move on from. But it might also be, and this is, I think, the interesting Sartrean point, and the one that's closest to the Freudian idea of repression, it might be that some of your projects are such that you can't recognize this other thing about you. So the Inferiority Project is Sartre's kind of classic example of this. So he thinks the way it works is that you take on other goals and other projects which are wildly implausible for you, right? You're just not well prepared to suddenly become a concert pianist or something, and then you fail at them, and then you take that evidence of failure as evidence of your own kind of inferiority as a human being, right? Because you keep failing at these things. But the fact is, you've only taken on those things in order to fail at them, in order to prove that you're a failure. That's what he thinks is going on with some people. And he thinks that if that's your project, then it also means that when you reflect on your behavior and you reflect on those failures, they look to you like genuine attempts to do things that have failed. It can't be that you recognize that you only did them in order to fail, because that is kind of filtered out of your reflection on your own behavior by the Inferiority Project, which values seeing yourself as naturally inferior.
So that's it. That's the alternative to the notion of repression. It's the accumulation, as it were.
Well, it's the way in which projects kind of filter your vision of everything, including your own behavior. Yes, and as a result, it'll filter your reflection on behavior that's caused by those projects, just like the rest of your behavior.
So that's what keeps it down. So that's what keeps it invisible.
Yeah,
it's just a different mechanism.
Yes, but it's not quite a mechanism, because it's the mechanism of how a project operates. That's mechanistic. It shapes your perception, but which projects you have is a matter of choice.
Once they become clear to you.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot going on that's very, very similar there, isn't there?
Yeah, there is. I mean, this is it. I think they're much more Freudian than they've been given credit for, in exactly this kind of a way. Yeah.
And that something needs to happen to allow something to become visible. And in fact, in the therapeutic room, you often are witness to that moment. And it almost does seem like you're crossing the boundary.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah.
Well, Johnathan, our time's up, and I should just be making some concluding remarks, but instead I'm going to ask you a ridiculous question to ask at the end of something like this, of which I can think you've got at least one of three, if not more, answers. One, you said it already. Two, we should buy the book. And three, we could take a chance and see if we could invite you back again. But the question is, it was something you said about phenomenology earlier. You're saying that psychotherapy, existential psychotherapy, is given too much emphasis on Heidegger and Kierkegaard and not on Sartre and de Beauvoir. Yeah. And can you just, in concluding, unless you want to answer the three suggested answers, could you just say, why can't we get there, with Heidegger and Kierkegaard?
That would be another talk, but I'm not sure. I mean, I think my main point was rather that there's useful perspectives in Sartre and Beauvoir which don't necessarily come out if you think of them as just part of that same existential tradition, and you don't see the Freudian perspective in their work. And once you do see it that way around, then that opens up more things to think about. Yeah. But so of the three options you've given me, I'd like to take all three, please.
Well, we're certainly delighted to do that. So look forward to hearing you again. But thank you so much for taking the time and the trouble, really, that the work you put in to make this presentation today. I think I'm sure we all very, very much appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming and for your questions. Thank you very much.
Well, we've got, just to say that our next talk is on the 2nd of December, on Thursday, when we've got Erica Berman talking about Fanon's phenomenology and the psychopolitical therapy. So that's at 6 o'clock on the 2nd of December. But meanwhile, our training is continuing today. So, but we have a 10-minute break. So what I'll do is I'll just put people in a couple of groups now if they want to chat a bit more for 10 minutes. And then we'll come back and do our main training in 10 minutes time. So let me try and do that.
Good. Thanks once again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
It's just